The red Cessna just behind me is parked more or less exactly on the same spot as I was parked just after I did my first solo flight back in January 2012. So as a pilot, even though I was born in the UK, all of my flight training has been done in the French Aero Club system and more or less only in the French language. So even though English is my first language, I actually learned aviation English as a second language. And since I got my PPL, I've had the chance to do a number of flights, and a lot of those were to the UK, to various parts of the UK, to the south of the UK, to Wales, to Scotland, etc. And as a well, I suppose I would describe myself as a French pilot because I'm a product of the French system. There were some things that really struck me in terms of differences between flying in the UK and flying in France under VFR as a private pilot. And in this little video, we're going to go over some of the main differences. And I hope that both British pilots flying in France and French pilots flying in the UK will find this interesting. So the first and most noticeable difference when you leave French airspace and enter UK airspace is just how different the radar services provided to VFR pilots are from what you get in France. So to explain this a little bit better, we're going to go back to the Bordeaux Air Traffic Control approach room.
Now in France, the Flight Information Service is a national service which is provided by all of the regional approach control centres, and in some cases by en route control centres. So if you're flying around Bordeaux, for example, and you look at your French navigation chart, you'll see that the what's called SIV in French, Service d'Information de Vol, or Flight Information Service in English, is shown by a green dotted line. And these are the regional flight information services. And these services are operated by the controllers, as I said, at the regional approach centres. So for example, here in Bordeaux, Aquitaine is here, and it's controlled by the control centre at Bordeaux Mérignac Airport, so the approach control centre. The only possible exception to this is if you're going to fly through some military zones, like here is the case in Cazaux, and on the west coast of France, as you can see, all this red ink. Now, a lot of pilots look at this red ink and get very nervous, but in fact, when you want to fly through these zones, A, they're often not active, and B, all you really need to do is contact the airbase that's responsible for these zones, which in this case is Cazaux 119.6. So if you see red ink on the chart and you want to fly through the zone, just call the frequency and tell them what you want to do. It really is as simple as that. So when you call Aquitaine Information, your message comes here. This is the approach control room. Now it's not open at the moment because during quiet periods they move the approach control upstairs into the tower. But you'll notice that they have various different positions. So you have a TMA East, TMA West, and the one that we're interested in is the one over here, which is Info. Now, you'll notice that the info position is exactly the same as any other approach position. The reason being is that it is staffed by actual air traffic controllers rather than information agent. So sitting down here at the flight information station in the air traffic control center. Now, see, the advantage of having an actual air traffic controller speaking to you is that they can actually provide some kind of meaningful service. They can provide traffic information, they can provide a number of different services, which is not always the case in the UK. So I've come to sit at my approach simulator station for this next segment, and you will see I've got a nice view of the Air Transat Long Range 321 in the background, the best seat in town. So let's contrast what we just saw with how it works in the UK. So if you're flying VFR in the UK, low altitude, essentially you have 4 different levels of ATC service, which are defined under the regulations. So the most obvious one is when you're inside controlled airspace, in which case you are always under what is called a radar control service. So basically you're being followed by ATC. It becomes more complicated when you want to get radar services or ATC services when you're not inside controlled airspace. So you're on a route, You're staying outside of any kind of control zones, but you still want to talk to somebody to get information, to get traffic information, or just to have a nice voice to listen to you in case you get into trouble. Now in the UK, it is a very complicated and convoluted system. But if I'm flying outside of controlled airspace, the first thing to remember is that there is not such a thing as a national flight information service. If I want to get something similar to the flight information service that I get in France, I have to call the nearest air traffic service unit, is what they call it in the UK, basically somebody with a radar. So somebody with a radar could be the approach control service of the nearest airport, could be military control. I need to look at my chart and see what is the nearest air traffic service unit, and sometimes I have a choice between one or two, so it's up to me which one I call. Once I call them, I can then request 3 different levels of service. I can request a basic service, whereby I'm given a squawk code, the controller watches me, but that's about it. I can get traffic service, so I can request a traffic service. I'm given a squawk code, the controller watches me, and the controller also gives me traffic information. And also I can ask for what is called a deconfliction service, whereby I'm given a squawk code, the controller watches me, and I also get avoidance information from other traffic. Now the thing to remember is that these are control services outside of controlled airspace, so the controller is under no obligation to provide you with any service whatsoever, and dependent on their workload, quite often they will not be able to provide the service. It really depends on where you fly and when. And I can remember one of my first flights to the UK. I flew from, I think it was from Cardiff to Duxford, and just after departure from Cardiff we were en route to Duxford, and I had no idea about basic traffic and deconfliction service. Well, I kind of read about it on the internet, and we wanted to speak to Bristol Approach. We thought, oh, here's Bristol Approach, we'll do like we do in France, we'll just call them on the radio and say we're going from here to here. So I called Bristol Approach and I gave our information, so Foxtrot Hotel, Foxtrot Papa Golf. And then the first message I got before anything, not hello, nothing like that, it was just Foxtrot Papa Golf, what level of service do you require? And my response to that was, well, I'd like a good level of service actually. I don't think the guy was particularly amused.
The second most noticeable difference between flying in France and flying in the UK, particularly when you fly in the French Aero Club system, is just how formal everything is in the UK compared to in France. So when you land even at a small airfield in the UK, normally there are fences and barriers everywhere and everyone's got their lovely high-vis vest on. Whereas if you look at where I am at the moment, I'm standing on an apron at an airfield. There's not a barrier to be seen. There is not a high-vis vest in sight. People park their cars on the apron. You can have barbecues on the apron. If I wanted to, I could drive my car down the runway and nobody would say anything. Also, that formality extends to British flying schools and flying clubs, in the sense that in the UK, most flying is done in flying schools rather than flying clubs. So in France, the flying clubs are not-for-profit associations. So you're a member of the club and you rent the planes by the hour. The instructors are volunteers, so they're not paid for the flight time that they do. Whereas in the UK, most flying schools are profit-making businesses. Biggest difference with that in the UK, of course, is that you pay a lot more because obviously the business has to pay the salaries of the instructors, whereas in France, you're really paying cost price pretty much. And what makes it expensive, or what makes the prices go up really, is just the cost of fuel. The other thing I've noticed in UK flight schools compared to learning to fly in France is that they have acronyms for absolutely everything. So you have to do your Frida check, you have to think about Gumps, not Forrest Gump, some other kind of Gump. You have QS1, QXCs, SHITs. You have acronyms for absolutely everything, from doing your pre-flight inspection to flushing the toilet. Another big difference, you couldn't talk about flying in France without talking about food and airfield restaurants. It is very rare in France to find a bad airfield restaurant. In the UK, I've flown to a few airfields and Generally, the restaurants, they're not really restaurants, they're more like cafes of the greasy spoon variety, where you can get a burger or a hot dog or something like that. But it's very rare to find a bistro-type restaurant in the UK on an airfield. Here we have a few differences between flying in the UK and flying in France as a private pilot. Hope you found this video useful. Safe flights to all. Take care. Bye-bye.